boy, oh boy, oh boy. Do you all remember how this whole mess got started? We read about it a couple weeks ago, back in chapter 3 of the book of Esther. One day, our boy Haman, the villainous villain of the book of Esther, one day he was walking into the palace gates and he happened to walk by Esther's cousin Mordecai. As Haman passed by, Mordecai failed to bow down to him. Haman took this slight as a grave offense to his honor. And he decided as retribution, not only Mordecai needed to be punished, but in fact he decided that all of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire needed to die as a result of this slight. Now, if that sounds to you like a very disproportionate kind of whack job response to someone not bowing down to you, that is because it is. It's totally crazy. It's totally blown out of proportion. Now, as a trusted advisor to the king, Haman had a good deal of political authority. But at the end of the day, the Persian Empire was an absolute monarchy, so he had to get the king to sign off on this little plan of his. And genocidal maniac though he was, Haman was shrewd. Yes, he was. So when he went to the king, he did not mention a word about Mordecai. He did not let on that he was trying to settle a personal vendetta. Rather, he simply told the king that there was this people in his empire who flouted all of his commands, a people who set themselves apart from all others, who even followed their own set of laws. And it is in your interests, king, said Haman, it is in your interests not to let these people live. Now, trusting his advisor and his assessment of the situation, because why would anybody lie about something like this? The king, you will remember, he issued a decree that on March 7th of the following year, all of the Jews in his kingdom should be put to death. And so that is the mess, the very, very dangerous mess that Esther is trying to clean up in this morning's story, which comes primarily from chapter 7 of the book of Esther. Now, whereas Haman was a trusted advisor to the king, and he had a good deal of political authority and power, as queen, Esther really had no political power of her own. Her role was primarily a ceremonial one. So she didn't really have any influence over the king's domestic policies. She couldn't just simply ask him to rescind this decree that he put out. So she had to find a different way to convince the king to change his mind. And as women have done throughout history when they've been denied access to formal channels of power, she had to find an informal channel in order to access the king's power. And I recognize this is a dated reference, but has anybody ever seen that old movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding? Right? It's a great movie. But there's this scene in it where the main character, a woman named Tula, she's lamenting her father's demand that she break up with the man that she's in love with. And Tula feels like she has no choice because in a Greek household, the man is the head of the house. But in order to comfort her, Tula's mother says to her, she gives her this little nugget of wisdom. She says, yes, the man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck, and she can move that head whatever way she wants. Right? And that's exactly what we see Esther do in this morning's story. Because while she has no political power of her own, over the past 5 years that she has been married to King Xerxes, she's had this amazing vantage point from which to observe the king and really get to know him. She knows his moods and his motivations, doesn't she? right? She knows how hot and cold he runs. She knows what makes this guy tick. Or put another way, she knows how to play this guy like a fiddle. And so what she does is this. She holds a banquet to which she invites both the king and Haman. She then gets them good and liquored up. And once they are thoroughly sauced, King Xerxes says to her, Esther, what is this banquet of yours all about? What is it that you are seeking after? To which Esther responds, I simply want my life and the lives of my people to be spared. For we have been sold to one who seeks to annihilate us. And then as a cherry on top of this, she says, if we were just being sold into slavery, I wouldn't even have mentioned it. Something as trivial as that. But it's just that because I'm going to be killed that I even brought it up to you at all, O king, my king. So she knows her husband, so she formulated this response in just the perfect way that she knew would get a rise out of him. She knew it would really get his back up, and that is exactly what happened. Upon hearing this, he was enraged. The king was enraged that someone would dare to lay a hand on his wife. Or let's be real here, the real dynamics of the situation, that someone would dare lay their hands on the king's property. And so he says to her, who would be so presumptuous as to lay a finger on you? To which Esther says, funny you should ask. It's actually this Haman guy right here. He is our enemy and our adversary. Now, upon hearing this, the king's rage just kind of boils over to the extent that he actually has to leave the room. He has to go out into the palace garden to cool down a little bit. Now, Haman here begins to recognize that his life is in peril, so he literally throws himself at Esther's mercy. He throws himself down on the couch on which Esther is reclining. And I think, as we all probably know here in this room, it was Persian law at the time that no man should come within 7 steps of a woman in the king's harem, of which Esther was one. So when the king walks back in the room and sees Haman spread out on Esther's couch, he immediately accuses him of assault. And thus Haman's fate is sealed. Now, as a testimony to how well loved Haman is around the palace, without any prompting whatsoever, and almost immediately, one of the king's eunuchs piped up and said, King, Haman had put up this spiked pole next to his house on which he intended to impale Mordecai. And the king says, well, that will do nicely. Let's impale Haman on it instead. And so it is that Haman, the villainous villain of the book of Esther, met his end. So what we see going on in this morning's story is this stark contrast being drawn between Haman and Esther. Both of these two characters are seeking after the king's power, it is true, but they intend to use the king's power in 2 very, very, very different ways. So Haman, on the one hand, he is seeking out the king's power because he wants to use it for himself. He wants to use it to settle a personal score. And what's more, he wants to use it against other people. So ultimately, he wants to use this power for the purposes of death. And then Esther, on the other hand, she is also seeking the king's power, but she is seeking the king's power because she wants to help and protect people. Is she included in that number? Yes, she is, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Ultimately, she wants to use that power in a way that leads to life. So what we are seeing in this story, I think being demonstrated very clearly, is that the king's power and governmental power and human power more generally, what we are seeing is that power in and of itself is not a good thing or a bad thing. But rather, power is just a neutral thing. And it depends on what we do with it to determine whether it's good or it's bad. As the author Elizabeth Gilbert puts it, power is like tofu. It's what you do with it that gives it its flavor. And funnily, we actually see the same dynamic kind of pop up in the ministry of Jesus himself. So as Jesus traveled through the Galilean countryside, healing folk and casting out demons, time and again he was accused by the religious authorities of his day of being an agent of Satan. And each and every time Jesus was met with these accusations, he said to them, paraphrasing here, he says, look at how I'm using my power. Just look at how I'm using my power. I'm helping people. I'm healing people. I'm making people whole. That is God's way of using power, not Satan's way of using power. Clearly, Jesus said, I am not an agent of Satan. I'm doing this for God. So both in Esther and in the person of Jesus, we see this. We see that power in and of itself is not good or bad. It's all about what we do with it. Now, why is that an important teaching for us? Now, that is an important teaching for us as nice, progressive Christians, because we tend to shy away from power in a way that our conservative brothers and sisters do not. Right? We like Jesus a whole lot. And in some really beautiful and really authentic ways, we try to model our own lives on the love and the mercy and the compassion with which Jesus Christ himself lived his life. And that's a good thing to do. That's a noble thing to do. But what we tend to do at the same time then is also look down our noses at the political kind of people, power-seeking kind of people, those kind of people who will grab after whatever little bit of power they can get their greedy, grubby little hands on. Right? Washington, D.C. Ugh. Congress. Ugh. The Senate. Ugh. Can you think of any less Christian institutions than those? Right? But what that means is, what our aversion to power means is, that the people going out and collecting power for themselves and then using power in the world are exactly the kind of people that we do not want wielding that power. They are people like Haman, right, who are going to use that power for themselves. They are people like Haman who want to use that power against other people. And I think we're seeing that play out pretty dramatically right now in our Supreme Court, are we not? But both Esther and Jesus point us to an alternative way of being in the world. They show us that power can be used in a good way, in a godly way, in a way that helps and heals and protects and makes whole. That power can be used not to lead to death, but it can be used to lead to life and life abundant. Which is all to say that if in the course of your life you come across a candidate for whatever office that they are running for, whether it's a dog catcher or whether it's president of America, if you come across a candidate that you think is a good person, a truly good person, a worthwhile candidate, you should probably use some of the power that you have in your life to make some phone calls, write some letters, knock on some doors, try to get that person a little more power. But if the case instead is that you're surveying the field of candidates and everybody in your estimation is a total moron, maybe that means that you are the one who needs to be running for that office, be it for city council, be it for state senate, be it for Congress. Maybe you are the person who needs to be stepping up and claiming some of that power for yourself. If you have a kid, if baby Charlotte, it turns out that she has a special love of social studies or debate or politics or government, maybe we should encourage her or whatever child to become a mayor, a congressperson, a president. Not because our current ones are really good role models that we want our kids to be like, but rather because we believe. Because we truly believe that our world could be made a better place if the people who had power and the people who used power were people who were steeped in and shaped by that love and that mercy and that justice that Esther so exemplified, and Jesus Christ himself so embodied. Friends, let's go out and make it so. Amen.